Hampshire, May 1817. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Ashford Manor's library, casting golden rectangles across leather-bound volumes and well-worn Persian carpets. Miss Verity Ashford sat curled in her favourite window seat, a copy of Tacitus in the original Latin balanced on her lap, her hazel eyes moving rapidly across the ancient text as her lips formed silent translations. At 24 years old, she had learned to treasure these stolen hours of solitude, precious moments when her mother's relentless campaign to secure her marriage could be temporarily forgotten in favour of the intellectual pursuits that truly nourished her spirit. The sharp clatter of hooves on the drive shattered her peaceful concentration. Verity glanced up, frowning at the interruption, and watched through the window as an impressive black carriage bearing an unfamiliar crest rolled to a stop before the manor's entrance. The vehicle was clearly expensive, the horses thoroughbreds of exceptional quality, and the livery worn by the coachman spoke of wealth far beyond anything her family could claim. She felt a flutter of unease in her chest, wondering what could possibly bring such obvious aristocracy to their modest country home unannounced. It was then that her carefully ordered world began its inexorable transformation. Verity! Her mother's voice carried up the stairs with unmistakable panic. "Verity Ashford, where are you?" Lady Ashford burst into the library moments later, her face flushed with a mixture of excitement and alarm that Verity had learned to recognize as particularly dangerous. Her mother's eyes swept the room, landing on Verity with an expression that suggested she had discovered something deeply embarrassing, rather than her eldest daughter engaged in perfectly respectable reading. "What are you doing here?" Lady Ashford demanded, hurrying forward to pluck the book from Verity's hands. "Latin? Again? We have guests of consequence arriving at this very moment." "I was merely reading, Mamma," Verity replied, rising from the window seat with as much dignity as she could muster. "Surely there is no harm in that." "No harm?" Her mother's voice rose several octaves. "The Earl of Blackstone has just arrived without warning, and I find you sequestered here with dusty old books like some peculiar recluse. What must he think?" The Earl of Blackstone. Even Verity, who paid minimal attention to society gossip, knew that name. Lord Julian Winters was legendary throughout England, a man of immense wealth and political influence whose opinions could make or break careers in Parliament. He had inherited his title at the age of 24 under tragic circumstances, and had spent the subsequent decade building a reputation for cold calculation and impossible standards. "Why on earth would the Earl of Blackstone visit us?" Verity asked, genuine confusion replacing her initial annoyance at the interruption. "He requires consultation with your father on some urgent parliamentary matter," Lady Ashford said, wringing her hands anxiously. "But that is beside the point. You must go to your room immediately and remain there for the duration of his visit." Verity stared at her mother in disbelief. "You want me to hide in my room like a child?" "I want you to avoid becoming a spinster without a roof over her head," her mother said sharply, a note of genuine, desperate fear piercing through her anger. "The Earl is unmarried, Verity. Unmarried and wealthy beyond imagination. Your sister Lydia is visiting with several of her friends from London, all perfectly accomplished young ladies who know how to behave appropriately around gentlemen of quality. I cannot have the Earl seeing our blue-stocking daughter and forming the impression that the Ashford family raises peculiar, unfeminine women. I'm trying to save you from a future of poverty." The words stung, though Verity recognized the anxiety beneath them. She had heard variations of this speech countless times over the years, each iteration a reminder that her intellectual interests were viewed as defects rather than accomplishments. "Very well, Mamma," Verity said quietly, moving toward the door. "I shall make myself scarce." Lady Ashford's expression softened slightly, guilt flickering across her features before being replaced by determined resolution. "It is for the best, darling. These gentlemen of high rank have very particular ideas about what makes a suitable wife. Intelligence in a woman often makes them uncomfortable. Better that the Earl sees Lydia and her friends, girls who understand how to charm rather than challenge." Verity retreated to her room as instructed, but solitude proved impossible to maintain. Within half an hour, Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper, appeared at her door with an apologetic expression and a domestic crisis that required Verity's immediate attention. The cook had questions about the menu for an unexpected dinner, and several bills from local merchants needed approval before payment could be authorized. This was the secret that Lady Ashford preferred to ignore. While she orchestrated social maneuvers and fretted over propriety, it was Verity who actually managed the household's daily operations. Sir Geoffrey was a brilliant man, but utterly hopeless at practical organization, and Lady Ashford considered such matters beneath her attention. The servants knew who truly kept Ashford Manor running smoothly, even if that person received no credit for her efforts. Verity spent the next hour moving through the servants' passages, consulting with staff and resolving issues, all while carefully avoiding the main rooms where the Earl and her father conducted their business. She could hear voices occasionally, male tones discussing matters of state with the seriousness such topics deserved. Once, she heard her mother's voice, joined by younger female laughter, and she could imagine perfectly the scene unfolding in the drawing room. Lydia and her friends were deployed like decorative artillery, all simpering smiles and carefully practiced charm. "Be charming, not intelligent," she heard her mother's voice carrying from the hallway outside the drawing room as Verity passed through the servants' corridor. Men of his rank dislike clever women. They want wives who smile and agree and defer to their superior judgment always. Not a single one of you should express an opinion on anything more substantial than the weather or the latest fashions. Verity rolled her eyes and continued toward the library, where she needed to retrieve a ledger. The hypocrisy never ceased to amaze her. Her mother had secured Sir Geoffrey's proposal 26 years earlier, precisely because she was clever enough to recognize a promising young gentleman with excellent connections despite his modest income. Yet now, she preached the gospel of feminine ignorance, as though intelligence were some sort of social disease. She had just located the ledger she needed when the library door burst open without warning. "Verity!" Sir Geoffrey stood in the doorway, slightly out of breath and clearly agitated. "Thank heavens I have found you. I need your skills immediately." "Papa, Mama said I was to remain out of sight," Verity protested, even as she moved automatically toward her father. Years of assisting with his work had created reflexes that overrode social concerns. "Nonsense," Sir Geoffrey waved off her objection impatiently. "This is an emergency. There is a clause in the treaty documents containing archaic legal syntax that is absolutely critical to tomorrow's vote. The Earl and I have been arguing about the intended meaning for the past half hour. It is not merely the French, but the obscure diplomatic phrasing that confounds us. You are the only person I know whose philological expertise is refined enough to pass the nuance." Before Verity could form another protest, her father had taken her arm and was propelling her toward the drawing room, where, she realized with growing mortification, the Earl of Blackstone awaited. She caught a glimpse of herself in the hallway mirror as they passed, taking in her simple morning dress of pale green muslin, her dark hair pulled back in a practical knot rather than any fashionable arrangement, and her complete lack of the elaborate preparation that one might ideally wish before meeting a peer of the realm. The drawing room was more crowded than she had anticipated. The Earl stood near the fireplace, a tall and imposing figure in immaculate riding clothes that spoke of wealth, worn with complete comfort. His dark hair showed threads of silver at the temples, and his face carried the stern, angular features of a man accustomed to authority. Beside him, documents were spread across a side table in disorganized profusion. Lady Ashford occupied a settee with Lydia, and three of her friends arranged like a painting titled "Young Ladies of Quality." All five women wore expressions of frozen horror at Verity's unexpected entrance. "My lord, may I present my eldest daughter, Miss Verity Ashford," Sir Geoffrey announced with obvious pride that made Verity want to sink through the floor. "She possesses considerable skill with languages and has been invaluable to my work on numerous occasions." The Earl turned to face her fully, and Verity found herself meeting eyes of pale grey that seemed to see far more than she wished to reveal. His gaze was penetrating, analytical, the look of a man who evaluated everything and everyone according to rigorous standards. She executed a proper curtsy, painfully aware of how plain she must appear compared to the elaborately dressed young ladies watching this encounter with barely concealed glee at her obvious discomfort. "Miss Ashford," the Earl said, his voice a deep baritone that commanded attention without apparent effort. "Your father speaks highly of your abilities. I confess I had not realized he had a daughter with such accomplishments." There was no mockery in his tone, which surprised her. Verity had grown accustomed to men regarding her education as either amusing or vaguely threatening, but the Earl's expression suggested genuine interest rather than condescension. "My father is generous in his praise, my lord," Verity replied, proud that her voice remained steady despite the mortifying circumstances. "I merely assist him with the more tedious aspects of translation." "And German," Sir Geoffrey added enthusiastically, oblivious to his wife's murderous expression. "And Latin, of course. She was reading Tacitus when I found her just now. In the original text, naturally." The Earl's eyebrows rose slightly, the first crack in his stern demeanour. "Indeed. That is remarkable, Miss Ashford. I confess my own Latin has grown rusty from disuse. Perhaps you might assist us with this troublesome passage." What followed was one of the most intellectually stimulating hours of Verity's entire life. The treaty document in question involved territorial concessions following the recent war, and the archaic phrasing employed by the diplomats was deliberately ambiguous. Sir Geoffrey and the Earl had been arguing about whether a particular clause referred to immediate or graduated implementation of the specified concessions. Verity studied the text carefully, aware of multiple pairs of eyes watching her with varying degrees of disbelief and disapproval. She let the complex words settle in her mind, considering not just the literal translation, but the diplomatic context and the linguistic conventions employed in such formal documents. "The phrasing here is indeed ambiguous in isolation," she began slowly, choosing her words with care. "However, if one considers the parallel structure employed in the preceding clauses, there is an implicit graduated timeline being established. The diplomats use specific imperative terms when they intend immediate action, but this particular phrase suggests action within an appropriate time frame. Given the logistical complexities mentioned earlier in the document, it must refer to implementation across several years rather than immediate compliance." The Earl stared at her for a long moment, his grey eyes intent. Then, to her complete surprise, he challenged her interpretation. "But Miss Ashford, that reading depends upon assuming consistency of usage throughout the document. What if different sections were drafted by different diplomats with varying linguistic preferences? The immediate context of this specific clause suggests urgency rather than gradualism." Verity felt something spark to life in her chest, a thrill of intellectual engagement that she had experienced too rarely in her life. Here was someone who did not simply dismiss her interpretation or accept it out of polite condescension, but who engaged with her reasoning and pushed back with substantive counter-arguments. "An excellent point, my lord," she acknowledged, warming to the debate. "However, if you examine the signature page, you will note that this entire section of the treaty bears the mark of a single chief negotiator, which suggests unified authorship and therefore consistency of terminology. Moreover, the legal tradition in these diplomatic documents heavily favors such graduated interpretations unless immediate action is explicitly specified." They argued for another 20 minutes, passing nuances of phrasing and diplomatic convention with an intensity that made the rest of the room's occupants fade into insignificance. The Earl proved himself remarkably well-informed, and he defended his positions with the tenacity of a man accustomed to winning arguments through force of logic and evidence. But Verity held her ground, matching him point for point, and gradually she saw his expression shift from skepticism to consideration to, finally, acceptance. "Your interpretation is sound, Miss Ashford," the Earl said at last, a note of what might have been admiration entering his voice. "Indeed, it clarifies several contentions that have been troubling the committee for weeks. I am deeply grateful for your insight." "You are too kind, my lord," Verity deflected automatically, but the Earl was not finished. "Not kind, merely accurate," he corrected. "You possess a remarkable mind, Miss Ashford. Tell me, have you had opportunity to study diplomatic history more broadly? I should be curious to hear your thoughts on the Vienna Congress proceedings." And thus began another discussion, ranging across topics of politics and history, with a freedom that Verity had never experienced in mixed company. The Earl treated her opinions as worthy of serious consideration, engaging with her ideas rather than dismissing them with patronizing approval. He questioned her assertions, forcing her to defend her reasoning, and when she made particularly strong points, he acknowledged them with the respect one intellectual accords another. Lady Ashford's entry into this fascinating exchange was like cold water thrown on a fire. "My lord, surely you must be parched after such intensive discussion," she announced with forced brightness, moving between Verity and the Earl with the determination of a general deploying troops. "Perhaps some refreshment. And I know my daughter Lydia and her friends have been absolutely dying to make your acquaintance. They are all such accomplished young ladies, recently come from London, where they have been enjoying the season." The Earl's attention was pulled forcibly toward the settee, where the young ladies in question sat arranged in postures of studied grace. They giggled and fluttered and performed precisely as they had been instructed, offering compliments about the Earl's reputation and asking questions designed to showcase their own charms, rather than express genuine curiosity about his answers. Verity watched the Earl's face shudder, the animated interest that had illuminated his features during their debate, giving way to an expression of polite tolerance, barely concealing profound boredom. He responded to the young lady's questions with courteous brevity, but his gaze kept drifting back toward Verity, who had retreated to a chair near the window and attempted to make herself invisible. "Miss Ashford," the Earl said after enduring perhaps 10 minutes of inane chatter about fashion and gossip, "you mentioned an opinion regarding Wordsworth's latest work. I should very much like to hear it, as I confess I found his recent collection rather disappointing." Verity glanced at her mother, who looked as though she might suffer an apoplexy, then back at the Earl. His expression was expectant, genuinely interested in her response, rather than merely making polite conversation. She could not resist such an invitation. "I found the collection uneven, my lord," she admitted. "At his best, Wordsworth captures the natural world with profound sensitivity, but in his weaker moments, he becomes self-indulgent and overly sentimental. The poem about the daffodils, for instance, possesses genuine beauty, but some of the later pieces in the volume descend into maudlin excess." "You are quite wrong about the daffodils, of course," the Earl replied, and she saw the hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "That particular poem is precisely the sort of sentimental drivel that represents everything wrong with contemporary poetry. But I admire your conviction in defending an indefensible position." They argued about Wordsworth for another quarter hour, their verbal sparring a delight to both participants, while Lady Ashford's expression progressed through stages of horror, resignation, and finally a calculating shrewdness that Verity recognized as potentially dangerous. The young ladies on the settee gradually fell silent, their prepared performances abandoned in the face of the Earl's obvious disinterest in their charms compared to his fascination with Verity's opinions. When the Earl finally took his leave, he surprised everyone by requesting an invitation to dinner. "I find myself reluctant to conclude our discussion of poetic merit, Miss Ashford," he said, addressing her directly, despite her mother's obvious desire to redirect his attention. "If Sir Geoffrey and Lady Ashford would permit, I should be honored to continue our debate over dinner this evening. That is, if you have no objection to my unexpected imposition on your hospitality." "We should be delighted, my lord," Sir Geoffrey responded, before his wife could formulate a response. "Absolutely delighted. Shall we say 7 o'clock? After the Earl's departure, chaos erupted. Lady Ashford fluctuated wildly between excitement that the Earl had shown interest in her family and horror that it was Verity rather than Lydia who had captured his attention. Lydia herself appeared torn between sisterly pleasure at Verity's unexpected success and dismay that her own careful preparation had gone entirely unnoticed. The visiting friends departed with barely concealed glee at having witnessed such an unusual scene, clearly eager to spread gossip about the peculiar bluestocking who had somehow entranced the notoriously particular Earl of Blackstone. "I cannot understand it," Lady Ashford muttered as she supervised frantic preparations for an elaborate dinner. "The man is an Earl, Verity, an Earl. And you sat there arguing with him about poetry as though he were some fellow scholar rather than one of the most eligible bachelors in England. You should have been demure, agreeable, feminine." "He asked my opinion, Mamma," Verity replied quietly. "Was I to lie about my views to appear more agreeable?" "Yes," her mother exploded, then caught herself and lowered her voice. That is precisely what you should have done. Men do not want wives who contradict them, especially not men of his rank and consequence. They want companions who soothe their egos and make them feel intelligent and important. Then perhaps, Verity said slowly, Lord Blackstone is not like most men. The dinner that evening was a revelation. Away from the performed theatrics of her mother's drawing room, with conversation flowing naturally among the smaller party, Verity discovered that the Earl possessed not just intelligence, but genuine warmth carefully concealed beneath layers of aristocratic reserve. He discussed literature and philosophy with ease, revealing himself to be well-read beyond matters of state, and he laughed, actually laughed with genuine amusement, when Verity challenged his interpretation of a Wordsworth sonnet. "You are quite wrong, of course," she said, emboldened by his obvious enjoyment of their debate, "but I admire your conviction in defending such an indefensible position." The Earl's laugh was rich and unrestrained, transforming his stern features into something approaching handsome. "Touché, Miss Ashford. I perceive I have met my match in the art of polite contradiction." Sir Geoffrey observed the exchange with barely concealed satisfaction, while Lady Ashford watched with an expression of confused calculation, clearly trying to determine whether this unprecedented development was disastrous or miraculously advantageous. Lydia, to her credit, seemed genuinely pleased for her sister, though perhaps puzzled by the Earl's obvious preference for intellectual sparring over conventional flirtation. The evening concluded with the Earl requesting permission to call again the following afternoon. "I find I have several more matters requiring consultation with Sir Geoffrey," he said formally, but his eyes settled on Verity as he continued. "And I confess I am curious to hear Miss Ashford's thoughts on the Wordsworth matter we left unresolved. That is, if such an imposition would not be unwelcome." "Not at all, my lord," Sir Geoffrey assured him. "You are always welcome at Ashford Manor." After the Earl's departure, Verity retreated to her room, her mind whirling with the unexpected events of the day. She had experienced enough of society to recognize the danger of reading too much into a gentleman's polite attention, yet something about the Earl's focused interest felt different from the casual courtesy she occasionally encountered at local assemblies. He had looked at her as though she were genuinely interesting, as though her thoughts mattered beyond their utility in resolving diplomatic ambiguities. She fell asleep that night with his words echoing in her memory, the timbre of his voice when he laughed, the intensity of his grey eyes when they locked with hers across the dinner table. The following weeks established a pattern that would have seemed impossible before the Earl's unexpected arrival. He called at Ashford Manor with remarkable frequency, always ostensibly to consult with Sir Geoffrey on parliamentary matters, but anyone with eyes could see that his true purpose was to seek Verity's company. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, literature and philosophy, politics and history, the proper education of the lower classes, and the responsibilities of those born to privilege. The Earl treated Verity's thoughts as worthy of serious consideration, engaging with her ideas as intellectual equals, rather than offering the patronizing indulgence she had come to expect from educated men. He challenged her reasoning, pushed back against conclusions he considered faulty, and when she made particularly strong arguments, acknowledged her superior logic with a graciousness that made her heart race. For Verity, these conversations were water in a desert. She had spent years starved for intellectual engagement, relegated to discussions of household management and local gossip when her mind craved substance and complexity. The Earl offered her what she had barely dared to hope existed, a man who valued her intelligence rather than viewing it as a defect requiring concealment or correction. Lady Ashford observed these developments with shrewd maternal calculation. "The Earl calls with remarkable frequency," she noted one afternoon after he had departed, following a 3-hour visit that had begun with diplomatic consultation and ended with animated debate about agricultural reform. "Most irregular for a man of his standing. He seems quite attentive when you are present, Verity." "He requires father's counsel on parliamentary matters," Verity deflected, not daring to hope her mother's observation reflected reality rather than wishful thinking. "Nothing more." "And does he require your counsel?" Lady Ashford asked pointedly, "because I notice he seems quite particular about timing his visits to hours when you are available, and he appears remarkably disappointed on the occasions when you are occupied elsewhere." Verity had no answer to that, because her mother's observation aligned uncomfortably with her own secret hopes. But she had learned years ago the danger of building castles from the insubstantial material of a gentleman's polite attention. The Earl was being kind, perhaps even enjoying their intellectual exchanges, but that was vastly different from actual romantic attachment. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. The Earl arrived earlier than expected, surprising Verity alone in the library where she was reviewing household accounts. The door was properly open as propriety demanded, but they were effectively unchaperoned for the first time since his initial visit. "Miss Ashford," he said, his voice carrying an unusual note of tension, "forgive my early arrival. I came hoping to find you specifically, as there is a matter I wish to discuss that does not involve your father's parliamentary expertise." Verity set aside her ledger, her pulse beginning to race. "Of course, my lord. How may I assist you?" The Earl crossed the room to stand near her chair, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, evidence of years spent shouldering responsibilities that would have crushed lesser men. He seemed to be struggling with some internal debate, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something approaching uncertainty. "I find myself in unfamiliar territory," he began slowly, choosing his words with obvious care. "I came to Ashford Manor initially for reasons of duty, nothing more than a brief consultation on a diplomatic matter. Yet I have returned again and again, and the reasons for those visits have become less about duty and more about you, Miss Ashford." Verity's heart hammered so loudly she was certain he must hear it. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words emerged. The Earl continued, seeming to take courage from having begun. "I have spent my entire adult life prioritizing duty above personal desire," he said. "I never questioned that choice until I met a woman who challenges me intellectually, who makes me laugh, whose presence has become essential to my peace of mind. I wish to court you properly, Verity. With your permission and your father's blessing, I should like the opportunity to see if what I feel might be reciprocated." "You barely know me," Verity managed, her voice emerging as barely more than a whisper. "What you have seen are carefully curated moments, pleasant afternoons. You cannot base such a significant decision on so little acquaintance." "Then let me witness everything," Julian replied, and she noticed distantly that he had used her given name without the formal prefix. "Let me see the flaws and complications included. I want to know everything about you, Verity. I want to hear your thoughts on matters trivial and profound. I want to make you laugh and debate with you until dawn. I want you in my life, in whatever capacity you will allow." Verity felt tears prick her eyes, emotion overwhelming her careful composure. Logic demanded caution, cataloguing all the reasons why this could not possibly work. They came from different worlds. His life would demand sacrifices she could barely imagine, and marriage to an Earl meant scrutiny and obligation. But her heart, that treacherous organ she had tried so hard to protect, whispered a different truth. "I would be lying if I said your visits meant nothing beyond professional courtesy," she admitted quietly. "You have become someone whose absence I feel keenly, someone whose arrival brightens my day, someone I think about far more often than propriety would deem appropriate." The relief and joy that transformed the Earl's face was remarkable to witness. The stern, controlled features she had come to know softened into an expression of such transparent happiness that she understood in that moment how carefully he had been guarding his own emotions, how much courage this admission had required. "Then I may court you?" he asked, and there was almost boyish eagerness beneath the formal phrasing. "I may try to win your affection." "You may," Verity confirmed, allowing herself to smile. "Though I warn you, my lord, I am not easily won. I have standards." "Thank God for that," Julian replied fervently. "I have no interest in easy victories, only worthy ones." The season that followed was both wonderful and overwhelming. Word spread through society that the Earl of Blackstone was courting Miss Verity Ashford, a gentleman's daughter of no particular distinction, and the attention was immediate and intense. Women who had previously barely acknowledged Verity's existence suddenly sought her company, their motivations ranging from genuine friendship to transparent attempts at securing proximity to the Earl through association with his chosen lady. Mothers of unmarried daughters regarded her with expressions ranging from envy to outright hostility, unable to comprehend how this unremarkable bluestocking had accomplished what their own carefully trained daughters had failed to achieve. Julian proved remarkably attentive throughout the scrutiny. He escorted her to balls and assemblies, claimed her first dance at every event, and engaged her in conversations that lasted far longer than propriety strictly permitted. He sent flowers daily, not ostentatious arrangements designed to impress but carefully selected blooms that referenced their ongoing debates. Yet Verity sensed shadows in him, places he kept carefully guarded, topics that made him withdraw into cold formality. She knew he had inherited his title following family tragedy, but the specifics remained unclear, and whenever she approached the subject, he deflected with practiced skill, redirecting the conversation towards safer territory. One evening, after Julian had been particularly evasive about his father's death, Verity sought out her own father for information. Sir Geoffrey's expression grew somber as he recounted the story. "The old Earl was murdered," he said quietly. "Business associate he had trusted for years, man named Harrison. There was a dispute over investments that had gone badly. Harrison became violent during an argument. Julian was at Oxford when it happened, came home unexpectedly and found the body himself. Only 21 years old. Verity's hand flew to her mouth in horror. How terrible! The poor man. It gets worse, Sir Geoffrey continued. The trial was public and sensational. Every sordid detail was exposed, examined, dissected for the entertainment of the masses. Julian had to testify, reliving the experience of finding his father's body again and again for the court's satisfaction. And then he discovered the estate was nearly bankrupt. His father had hidden massive gambling debts, borrowing against everything to cover losses. Julian inherited not just a title, but a catastrophe. "That explains so much," Verity murmured, thinking of Julian's obsessive control over every aspect of his life, his difficulty trusting others, his fear of vulnerability. "He became harder after that," her father agreed, "more controlled. He buried himself in duty and responsibility, rebuilding the estate and family reputation through sheer force of will. Many of us worried he had sealed himself off entirely from joy and connection. Until recently. Until he met you. You have changed something in him, Verity. Brought back a warmth we feared was lost forever." That evening, when Julian called as had become his custom, Verity interrupted his attempt to redirect conversation toward politics with a direct challenge. "Why do you do that?" she asked quietly. "Deflect whenever conversation approaches anything truly personal, redirect toward politics or literature, or safely impersonal topics." Julian tensed visibly, his shoulders going rigid and his expression shuddering. "I do not know what you mean." "Yes, you do," Verity pressed gently. "I know what happened to your father, Julian. I know about the ordeal you endured." His face went white, then flushed with anger and shame. "Who told you?" he demanded, his voice harsh. "Sir Geoffrey? Did he think sharing family tragedy made for entertaining gossip?" "Do not be angry with father," Verity said firmly. "I asked because I care about you, because I could sense you were carrying burdens you would not share, and I wanted to understand." "Understand what?" Julian bit out, standing abruptly and pacing toward the fireplace. "That I come from violence and scandal? That my inheritance was purchased with my father's blood? That I stood in a courtroom and described finding him?" He broke off, jaw clenched against emotions threatening to overwhelm his control. Verity rose and moved to stand beside him, propriety forgotten in the face of his obvious anguish. She took his hand in both of hers, holding firmly when he tried to pull away. "I wanted to understand why a man of such remarkable warmth and intelligence learned to guard himself so carefully," she said softly. "Why you find it difficult to trust, to open yourself to personal connection. Your father's death was not your fault, Julian. The violence that was visited upon him does not define who you are." "Doesn't it?" Julian's voice cracked with raw anguish. "I became Earl through murder. My entire position, everything I am, stems from that horrific act. And the worst part is that sometimes I hate him for dying, for leaving me alone to shoulder responsibilities I never wanted. And then I hate myself for feeling that way about a man who was murdered." Verity's heart ached for the pain he had carried alone for so many years. Being angry with your father does not make you a bad son, Julian. It makes you human. He died and left you to clean up the aftermath of his mistakes. Of course you are angry. That is a completely natural response to impossible circumstances. Julian stared at her, as though she had performed some sort of miracle. How do you do that? Make me feel less alone. Since my father died, I have carried these burdens in isolation, believing no one could understand or accept the darkness in me. Yet you look at me with such compassion, such acceptance. How? Because I see who you truly are beneath the armor, Verity replied. A good man who endured terrible things and emerged stronger, albeit at great cost. A man who deserves happiness and love, even if he does not believe it yet. What happened next felt inevitable. The culmination of weeks of growing attachment and emotional honesty. Julian pulled her into his arms with a careful reverence that made her eyes sting with tears, and when his lips met hers, the kiss contained both tender gentleness and deep passion. They stood locked together for a long moment, the rest of the world fading into insignificance. I love you, Julian said when they finally broke apart, his forehead resting against hers. I know it is too soon, that I should wait for a more appropriate moment, but I cannot keep the words inside any longer. I love you, Verity Ashford, with an intensity that both frightens and exhilarates me. Tears of joy spilled down Verity's cheeks. I love you too. I think I have since that first afternoon when you actually listened to my opinions instead of dismissing them, when you looked at me and saw a person rather than just a potential wife. As summer progressed, their alliance deepened despite the challenges that emerged with increasing frequency. Society proved less accepting of their attachment than Verity had hoped. One particularly difficult afternoon, Lady Ashford insisted Verity accompany her to a tea hosted by the Duchess of Waverley, an influential woman known for exacting standards and a sharp tongue clearly intended to assess the Earl's chosen bride. The tea was profoundly uncomfortable. The Duchess subjected Verity to subtle interrogation disguised as polite conversation, weighing every answer and finding each slightly wanting. Her family connections were acceptable but not impressive, her education adequate but lacking aristocratic refinements, her dowry respectable but decidedly modest compared to what the Earl might reasonably expect. The Earl of Blackstone could have his pick of England's finest families, the Duchess observed, her tone suggesting Verity should be immensely grateful for attention above her station. I trust you understand the responsibility that comes with such an advantageous match. I understand the Earl's character and qualities, Verity replied evenly. Those matter more to me than his title. The Duchess's smile did not reach her eyes. How charmingly naive, my dear. Title and responsibility are inseparable. The Earl cannot afford a wife who sees him merely as a man, rather than as a symbol of power and duty. His position demands someone who understands their role completely. The words struck deep, planting seeds of doubt that took root despite Verity's attempts to dismiss them. Was she truly suited for the life Julian offered? Could she navigate these treacherous social waters without embarrassing him? Did love alone suffice when facing such immense obstacles? That evening, Julian found her in the garden, where they had shared so many conversations. His concern was evident when he saw her troubled expression. What has happened? He asked without preamble. Something has upset you. Verity confessed about the tea, about the Duchess's words and the doubts they had awakened. Julian's expression grew stern as he listened, but when he spoke, his voice was firm rather than angry. The Duchess Waverley has been married to duty herself for 40 years and been utterly miserable because of it, he said. She mistakes suffering for virtue and expects everyone to embrace the same martyrdom. I refuse to follow that path, Verity. I refuse to sacrifice genuine happiness at the altar of social expectation. He explained that he wanted a union where they supported each other, not a marriage where duty consumed them entirely. He had watched his own parents build a marriage of genuine friendship and affection, despite the demands of their positions, and he wanted that same authenticity for himself. You make it sound simple, Verity said quietly. It will not be simple, Julian acknowledged. We will face criticism and judgment. Some will always consider you unworthy of me, just as some will consider me foolish for choosing love over advantageous alliance. But I would rather face those challenges with you than achieve easy acceptance without you." His sincerity moved her deeply. "I am frightened of failing you, of failing myself, of not being enough." "Good," Julian replied, and she looked at him in surprise. "If you were not frightened, I would worry you did not fully understand what we are undertaking. Fear means you are taking this seriously, recognizing the significance of what we are building. But do not let fear prevent you from accepting happiness, Verity. We both deserve that." She chose to trust him, to trust them, and the courtship continued with deepening commitment. 6 weeks before their planned engagement ball, disaster struck. A notorious scandal sheet published a vicious article dredging up every family indiscretion they could unearth. It mentioned a distant cousin's gambling debts, her maternal grandfather's involvement in trade, and a great-aunt's elopement decades earlier. The article painted Verity's family as barely respectable upstarts unworthy of connection to the Earl of B. It questioned everything from her education to her appearance to her motives in accepting Julian's suit. Fortune hunter, scheming adventuress, mercenary creature who somehow ensnared an Earl who should have known better. The words were calculated to wound, and they succeeded. Verity read the article alone in her bedroom, hands shaking as she absorbed the cruel characterizations that gave voice to every private doubt she had harbored. She wept despite her attempts at composure, the words cutting deeper because they echoed her own fears about reaching above her station and potentially damaging Julian's reputation through her inadequacy. Lady Ashford found her and offered comfort with surprising fierceness. "Do not give those words power, darling. They are lies designed to sell papers and cause pain." But Verity could not shake the fear. What if there is truth in it? What if I am reaching above my station? What if I damage Julian's reputation through my inadequacy? Julian's response surprised her. Rather than offering soothing platitudes, his face darkened with a cold, icy fury unlike anything she had seen from him. "Who wrote this?" he demanded quietly. "Defamation. I will destroy them." Verity protested that any legal action would only draw more attention, that it would be better to let the matter fade into obscurity. Julian's expression was flat with determination. "No, I will not allow lies about you to stand unchallenged. You deserve better than silence in the face of such viciousness." He did not lower himself to write public letters to the newspapers, for an Earl does not debate with gossip mongers. Instead, he utilized his considerable influence behind closed doors. He paid a quiet visit to the owner of the printing press, and he called in debts from powerful men who held sway over the publication's funding. He made it perfectly clear that any further mention of Miss Ashford would result in social and financial ruin for everyone involved. The effect was immediate and absolute. The attacks ceased instantly, and the society gossips, sensing the dangerous weight of the Earl's protection, quickly found other targets. The silence was not one of indifference, but of fear and respect. "You should not have troubled yourself so," Verity said when she learned of his actions. "It was only ink and paper." Julian took her hands firmly. "It was an attack on my future countess. I want them to know that you are under my protection, and that I value you above their petty judgments. You are worth defending, Verity. Always." The engagement ball at Blackstone Hall was magnificent and overwhelming. Verity arrived at the estate to find sprawling grounds with ancient trees and formal gardens. The house itself, a testament to centuries of wealth and power. The honey-colored stone glowed in the late afternoon sun, countless windows reflecting light, towers, and architectural details speaking of generations of aristocratic habitation. Julian stayed close throughout the evening, his hand at her back, providing both physical and emotional support. Conversations paused as they moved through the rooms, faces turning to regard them with expressions ranging from genuine pleasure to thinly veiled skepticism. The formal announcement came early in the evening. Julian addressed the assembled company with quiet authority. "It is my profound pleasure and privilege to announce my engagement to Miss Verity Ashford. She has done me the extraordinary honor of accepting my suit, and I look forward to introducing you all to the future Countess of Blackstone." The applause was varied. Some guests responded with genuine enthusiasm, family and close friends clearly delighted by the match. Others offered perfunctory acknowledgement, faces betraying reservations about a union between the powerful Earl and a gentleman's daughter of no particular distinction. Still others did not bother hiding their disapproval, dowagers with tight smiles and pursed lips, making their judgment clear without words. An endless parade of guests approached to offer congratulations, each requiring careful navigation. Well-wishers who were genuinely pleased proved easy, their warmth and sincerity a balm to Verity's nerves. Far more challenging were those who offered congratulations, while measuring her with critical eyes, smiles never reaching their faces, compliments carrying subtle barbs. "Such a charming match," one dowager observed, her tone suggesting anything but charm. "The Earl has always been so unpredictable in his choices." "How very fortunate for Miss Ashford," another added, the emphasis on fortunate making clear her opinion that Verity had secured a social elevation far beyond what her circumstances merited. Verity bore the subtle insults with outward grace, though each added weight to the burden of doubt she carried. Julian remained attentive, steering her away from the worst offenders when possible, but social obligation demanded they separate at times, leaving her to navigate treacherous waters alone. A group of young ladies cornered Verity with transparent eagerness, women who had barely acknowledged her existence before, but now sought her company with desperate enthusiasm. Their conversation centered on fashion and gossip, topics Verity found tedious under the best circumstances. However, she reminded herself that these women had their own skills and battles to fight, and she offered them polite attention, refusing to look down on them simply because their interests differed from her own. The evening wore on with excruciating slowness. She danced with various partners, made conversation with dowagers who assessed her with gimlet eyes, laughed at jokes that were not funny, and maintained a pleasant expression until her face ached from the effort. Finally, she escaped to the terrace, desperate for air and a moment's respite from the relentless scrutiny. "It does become easier," a female voice said from the shadows. Verity turned to find Lady Charlotte Winters, Julian's younger sister, whom she had met briefly earlier in the evening. Charlotte moved to stand beside her at the balustrade, gazing out at the moonlit gardens. "The first events are always the worst," Charlotte continued sympathetically. "Eventually you develop something like armor, not enough to make you immune to the judgments and cruelty, but sufficient to deflect the worst of it. You learn which battles are worth fighting and which are best ignored. You discover allies among women who genuinely wish you well and learn to avoid those who take pleasure in others' discomfort." "How do you bear it?" Verity asked quietly. "The constant evaluation, the sense that every word and action is being weighed and measured." Charlotte smiled sadly. "You remember why you chose this life. Julian loves you genuinely, and that is worth more than the approval of 100 spiteful dowagers. You create private spaces where society cannot intrude, sanctuaries where you can be yourselves without performance. And you develop selective deafness to the worst of the gossip while remaining alert to genuine threats." The advice was practical and grounding. Verity absorbed it gratefully, drawing strength from Charlotte's matter-of-fact acceptance that this would be difficult but survivable. They talked for another quarter-hour before social obligation demanded their return to the ballroom. But Verity felt fortified by the connection, grateful to have found an ally in Julian's sister. The weeks following the engagement ball passed in a whirlwind of preparations and increasing intimacy. Julian was remarkably open now that his emotional walls had been breached, sharing hopes and fears with touching vulnerability. They discussed the practicalities of married life, how they would manage the estates, what causes Verity wished to champion, how to balance public obligations with private needs. They agreed that certain aspects of their relationship would remain fiercely private regardless of social pressure or expectation. One evening, walking in the gardens of Ashford Manor, Julian spoke of his vision for their future. "I do not want a marriage of duty alone," he said, stopping to face her directly. "I have seen too many couples who exist in cold formality, performing their roles without genuine connection. I want a true alliance, Verity. I want to share my life with you fully, not merely occupy the same social spaces while remaining essentially alone." "I want that too," Verity assured him. "But I confess I am still learning how to navigate your world. I made a terrible misstep at the Duchess's tea last week." She had attended a gathering of influential ladies, where conversation turned to recent debates on charity and the poor laws. Forgetting Charlotte's warnings about political discretion, Verity had expressed her candid opinions on the moral obligation to the less fortunate, with perhaps more passion than wisdom. "Surely Christian charity demands we protect the innocence of the young," she had declared. "It is our moral duty to ensure that even the poorest children are not worked into early graves." The silence that followed had been deafening. The ladies present were shocked that a woman of Verity's position would express such heavy sentiments at a light social gathering. By the time the tea concluded, Verity knew her words would spread rapidly through society, catalogued as another example of her unsuitability for her elevated position. "I heard about the tea," Julian admitted when she finished her confession. "Apparently you expressed rather strong views to a very conservative audience." Their first serious argument as an engaged couple revealed the tensions they would need to navigate repeatedly, the balance between individual conviction and collective responsibility, between personal authenticity and public performance. Julian was frustrated that Verity had spoken so freely, without considering the political complications her views might create. Verity was hurt that he seemed to expect her to become fundamentally different from the woman he claimed to love. They argued with increasing heat until finally, exhausted, they fell into silence and began the difficult work of actually listening to each other. "I cannot expect you to abandon your principles," Julian said finally, his anger giving way to weary resignation. "I fell in love with a woman who speaks her mind and stands by her beliefs. To ask you to become someone else would be fundamentally dishonest." "And I need to understand the larger context within which you operate," Verity replied. "I will make mistakes, probably many of them, but I am trying to learn. Please be patient with me." They resolved through continued conversation to find compromise between silence and indiscretion. Verity would continue working for causes she believed in, but through channels that supported rather than complicated Julian's political efforts. He would trust that she was learning to navigate his world, even when she stumbled, and she would accept that some discretion was necessary without viewing it as a fundamental betrayal of her principles. "We are united in this," Julian said as the first light of dawn began brightening the sky. "That means we face challenges together, mistakes and all. I do not expect perfection from you, Verity. I only ask that we remain honest with each other." As autumn deepened into winter, Verity gradually found her footing. She discovered allies among other titled ladies who shared her philanthropic views, learning from them how to advocate effectively within society's constraints without causing political scandals. She threw herself into charitable work that allowed her to make real differences in people's lives while avoiding the sorts of public controversies that would complicate Julian's position. The wedding took place on a bright December morning in the chapel at Blackstone Hall. The small church was filled with hundreds of candles and arrangements of winter greenery and white roses that Verity had requested. Before the ceremony began, Sir Geoffrey found her in the vestry. He looked at her, resplendent in her ivory silk, and his eyes grew misty. "Verity," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I know I have often relied upon your intellect to aid my work, perhaps too heavily, but I want you to know that you are more than a scholar to me. You are a credit to this family, and I have never been prouder than I am today. Not because you are marrying an Earl, but because you have found a man who appreciates the brilliance I have always treasured." Verity hugged him, the validation healing a wound she hadn't realized she still carried. "Thank you, Papa." Julian watched her walk down the aisle on her father's arm, his face transforming with transparent joy and wonder that made her eyes sting with tears. They spoke their vows with unwavering conviction, their voices steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm them both. The rings they exchanged were meaningful rather than merely expensive. A sapphire that had belonged to Julian's grandmother for Verity, a matching band for him. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Julian kissed her with gentle reverence that communicated promise and devotion and relief and joy all together. The wedding breakfast was an elaborate affair with endless speeches and toasts and celebration. Verity participated while feeling oddly detached from the spectacle, her awareness fixed entirely on Julian, on the reality that they were truly married now, bound together in the eyes of God and society. When they finally departed for the hunting lodge on a private corner of the estate, complete privacy awaited them for the first time since their engagement. The week they spent at the hunting lodge established patterns that would sustain them through challenges ahead. They talked endlessly about everything and nothing, exploring ideas and dreams without fear of judgment. They walked the winter countryside hand in hand, finding beauty in frost-covered trees and frozen streams. They read aloud by the fire in the evenings, debating interpretations and laughing at each other's more outrageous claims. They discovered a depth of passion that matched their intellectual fire, finding a tenderness in each other's arms that words could not fully express. Most importantly, they solidified their union, establishing the foundation that would support them through inevitable trials. They discussed practical matters of estate management, causes Verity wished to champion, and how to balance public obligations with private needs. They agreed on boundaries. Certain aspects of their connection would remain private, regardless of social pressure or expectation. They promised to face challenges together, to communicate honestly even when difficult, to remember always that they were partners, choosing each other daily rather than prisoners of duty and obligation. Their first Christmas as husband and wife arrived only weeks later. Verity stood at the tall library window of Blackstone Hall, watching heavy flakes of snow fall across the extensive grounds, coating the world in pristine white. The fire crackled warmly behind her, casting a golden glow against the gathering twilight. 12 months earlier, she had been simply Verity Ashford, a gentleman's daughter resigned to spinsterhood, her days filled with quiet reading and household management, hiding her brilliance to avoid frightening potential suitors. Now she stood as the Countess of Blackstone, mistress of a great estate, looking out at a future that was vast and uncertain, yet filled with promise. She heard the door click shut, followed by the familiar steady tread of footsteps across the carpet. Julian joined her at the window, slipping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder in the easy intimacy they had fought so hard to secure. The heat of him against her back was a solid anchor against the cold world outside. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly, his breath stirring a loose tendril of her hair. "How remarkably different everything is from a year ago," Verity replied, leaning back into his embrace. "Last Christmas I was simply myself, living a quiet life with modest expectations. I never imagined I would be here with you." "Regrets?" Julian's voice held a note of vulnerability that suggested her answer mattered deeply. She turned in his arms to face him directly, meeting his grey eyes with complete honesty. Outside, the snow continued to fall, burying the past, but in here there was only warmth. "Not a single one," she whispered. "I have found a life far richer than I could have imagined. Not because of the title or the wealth, Julian, but because I am finally known. You see me, truly see me, and you love me anyway. That is the only victory that matters." "And you, Verity," he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with infinite tenderness. "You have taken a cold, empty house and turned it into a home. You have taken a man made of duty and scars and taught him how to live." His kiss was answer and affirmation, a promise made in the silence of the winter evening. They stood together against the falling dark, two minds and hearts finally perfectly aligned, ready to face whatever the years might bring, side by side. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If this story of intellectual connection and genuine partnership touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories of love, respect, and the courage to be yourself.